poetry, what's next? It can take, and often does take, two very distinct routes, and I want to talk a little bit about how they're different from each other. One is an approach that is sort of, I remember being here in these walls some months ago when Ben and Stephen Burt and Robert Ashenbaum, all of them doctors of philosophy, gave their 3 brilliant talks on the same subject. So I came here a little prepared. I was already told what's coming next in poetry. I was struck by the fact that Robert Ashenbaum's talk in particular, and as well as many other academic talks of this nature, are concerned with what has for some time seemed to me a kind of a sociology of poetry. In other words, there's this 20th century view. The 20th century was a very analytical century, you might say, when it comes to poetry. There were all these different approaches to it. You view it from this point of view, from that point of view, from the point of view of this identity, that identity, and eventually it becomes a kind of communal activity, and not necessarily defined by one specific set of principles, not a definite art form, really, but a kind of, a kind of ad hoc thing, a kind of ad hoc idea of poetry. Experimenting with the idea of what a poem can be, what poetry can be that it was not before, and so on and so forth. So speculating about the future of poetry, if one takes this academic route, so the sociological route, as it were, is about predicting what might happen to these communities in the future, how they might evolve, what new communities might emerge, what impacts might the new media have, like Kindle or iPhone, I don't know, or similar futuristic devices, on the nature of poetry. It seems to me more and more that on this kind of analysis, or once all these analytical approaches have been applied to poetry, what we end up with is a kind of supermarket. There's a kind of poetry supermarket that has many shelves, all marked according to the stuff that you find there. And the stuff is classified chiefly these days according to various concerns of identity and situations of identity, experiences of identity. We all well know what they might be. It's various minorities, various religious groups, various, sexual groups, gender groups, and so on. Each of them has a poetry of their own, and together they are poetries. They're not poetry, but poetries, and they evolve. And because they are, because in these groups, poetry is a kind of social activity, it's important. So you can choose what point of view suits best, fits best your own worldview or your own experience, and then you can associate with that kind of poetry, one of the many poetries, and identify with it and feel good about it. But my question is poetry really in the poetry supermarket at all, to begin with? And well, I have my doubts about it, but to delineate this from how I will go about answering this question of poetry, what's next, I'll just say that, of course, this inevitably, the question arises of whose poetry, right? What poetry? What's next? Whose poetry? What are we talking about? And it's no secret, of course, that every poet who wastes his life on this activity has thought a great deal about the past, the poetry's past, poetry as an experience with a history. And so any speculation about the future will be some kind of induction from this experience, from these reflections and so on. Here's what it seems to me poetry is. I think it's a kind of personal religion. And a kind of secular religion, if you will. Not necessarily secular, but it's not necessarily theistic either. In what sense is it like a religion? I think it's conveyed it conveys an important idea that I think in the modern world, other art forms and philosophy and even psychology, they're all suited to address these issues. But poetry addresses it at a sort of a gut level. By the way, I'm oblivious of time.
Take your time, Phil.
Okay, just give me the heads up if I run out of time, because it seems that I can't follow the notes that I just wrote down. In what sense is it religion? And this ties to the larger sense of now that we have this secular world from which religion is gone as the ultimate source of authority, kind of uniform source of authority. Now there's much diversity. One of the features of the supermarket is diversity. We all like diversity. So what happens if you take religion out of the equation? Suppose there's only science. The humanist worldview, the secular humanist worldview. What's wrong with that? There's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's not obvious that it's ethically any worse than the Christian worldview or the Muslim worldview and so on. However, there is one thing that I think will be missing in a big way if we altogether get rid of all kinds of religion. I'm not talking about organized versus disorganized religion. And it's, how should I put it? Well, think about mankind, humankind, man as a species, anthropos, sort of in terms of evolution, from the evolutionary point of view. In the very long time frame, we have evolved from worms, from dirt, from bacteria, to Bach and Mozart and Shakespeare and Sappho and Christ and the Buddha and Dante. I think the direction is very clear. And the direction, the way this thing points is a kind of error, a kind of arrow. Whereas it seems to me that in the materialist worldview, I've struggled, with this all my life. It seems to me that there's no ultimate philosophical reason to not be satisfied with yourself. I'm good enough. Why should I be any better than myself? And I think religion is poetry, like religion, is this archaic thing that knows something about the standard of nobility and the idea that we should strive to be better than ourselves. And there may be philosophical arguments or even scientific arguments as to why we should be altruistic, why we should not be selfish, and so on, why we should be ethical. But poetry gives you this at a gut level. And it so much that some of us, God knows, have wasted our lives on it. How does this relate to what's next? And being a little long-winded here. I think I've mentioned already that it was an analytical century of the 20th, and I think it has generated a lot of issues pertaining to poetry that are still much discussed, and I find that much of the critical discourse that goes on, it seems to be trapped in the binary oppositions that were created back then. And it seems to me that now there is time for a more synthetic view of things, and of course that synthetic view can only come from within a given poet. A poet has a personal past in the history of poetry, and so he or she has a personal future, a personal, deliberate, providential reader, and not some kind of, generalized society or generalized community for that matter. So I have jotted down a list of these issues that were much discussed in the last century, and I think unduly continue to dominate our discourse about these things. And I'll just briefly summarize it. Well, the issue of tradition versus innovation is one of them, and the issue of novelty versus kind of traditionalism and received ideas in poetry. I think this has been beaten to death, and it's become clear that sort of the truth is on neither extreme of the various kinds of statements and commitments that people have made about it. But Yeah, okay, anyway, language is another big thing. I think language is inherently, I mean, I speak as a linguist, I have some background in linguistics, and I speak various languages, and I love language. I think it's fascinating. But poetically, it's elementary. Language is boring. People who say that, oh, poetry is about language, when they justify this view in practice, I find that they always obsess about some very elementary things in language, such as, you know, it seems that in the last century we took the romantic cult of nature. In the 19th century we're contemplating nature, and then we took that out because it was no longer comme il faut for various reasons, and we replaced that with language. And this has profound ties with various intellectual trends, with the philosophy of language and all that stuff. So intellectually it's understandable, but I think it distracts, like many of these false issues, it distracts from this arrow that points somewhere, that points toward a kind of nobility, a kind of chivalry of spirit, as it were. The issue of whether poetry is desirable or possible after Auschwitz. About the issue of the limits of language. What's a limit of language? Could someone show me a limit of language? I mean, what does this even mean? Free verse versus formal verse? That's gone. I mean, both traditions have won. They have established themselves. And you know, there's a trick about why, there's a kind of a secret about why formal verse is never going away, because it's impossible to write free verse if you don't have perfect verbal pitch, as it were, which can only be developed if you're steeped in poetry. Otherwise, there's nothing. There are many things, like, you know, poetry as emotive diary, which is most kind of emotive journalism, which is what most poetry is these days. Poetry as articulation of identity. Anyway, so what remains? Now that I've made a short shrift of this, I think these are the things that remain. There's nobility and direction. And what is more important than the importance of poetry is its importance to the poet. I mean, there's academic fairness, right, which presupposes, which at its extreme has political correctness and presupposes this poetry supermarket. And on the other hand, there are all these personal decisions that a poet makes because poetry is the only way that he or she knows how to live, and we sort of have no way of going about sort of inventing ourselves in some programmatic way. Those of us who are truly poets, and I mean, I think people, I'm sorry, I'm being elitist maybe in this regard, but I think people fall into two broad categories. There are the poets and the non-poets, and the non-poets most of the time can never do anything about being such. And if I have a few more minutes, I'll say one thing about this great conceptual confusion that I think arose in the 20th century. If one thinks about metaphysical poetry, or even romantic poetry or modernism, none of those are self-names. None of those, you know, the Romantics did not call themselves the Romantics or the metaphysical poets. But in the 20th century, the direction is reversed. We have futurism, we have the 19th century we have the pre-Raphaelites, and so on and so forth. You see what I'm saying? You know, it seems that if one takes metaphysical poetry as an example, that is a natural kind. There were poets who wrote poetry, and they were going through their personal strifes. It ruined the life for John Donne for decades. You know, and John Herbert also became a priest and whatnot. I mean, it's fairly dramatic, and somehow these people captured the spirit of the time and the spirit of the language in their time and all that, and they came up with this poetic style that is described as metaphysical poetry. T.S. Eliot thought, and I think I agree with him, that it's a kind of natural kind, metaphysical poetry. On the other hand, we have in the 20th century all these self-proclaimed movements that are essentially artificial kinds. They're based on speculative ideas that come either from philosophy often, or from the realm of theory, which is a kind of a halfway house between philosophy and poetry. So we have these constructs that are defined often by motives and intentions that lie outside the realm of poetry as such, are, in other words, orthogonal to it, not strictly related to it. And if I may just conclude, so what's next, right? I mean, I think the only real issue that remains for the poet is, how do I perfect the art? How do I personally perfect the art? That's what's next. I mean, that's what I have to deal with. And for this, we need to know and digest the extent of the art, be completely steeped in poetry. There's the science of poetics, which is, much was made of the word in the last century. There are all kinds of ad hoc poetics and whatnot. There's too bad there's no plural of poetics. Poetics is.
Is the plural?
It should be, yes, shouldn't it? There's no single poetics. There are various poeticses. No, I'm kidding. There are some, not to minimize the impact of the 20th century, there were some brilliant, important ideas that have to do with poetics. Roman Jakobson's idea of metaphor versus metonymy, that's very useful to know, right? Defamiliarization. I'm just quoting a lot of Russians. Defamiliarization, Robert Shklovsky, sort of poetry as something that prevents us from becoming robots, from becoming robotized by our monotonous everyday reality. So we have to discipline ourselves, and how do we know who wins and who loses? Well, I think those poets win who do the hardest thing, according to the principles of their art. And there are too many things that are very easy to do, and one of them, the easiest thing to do, is to express one's particular identity or point of view, or where one was, or what happened, and what one felt, etc., etc. But what is the hardest thing? It's hard to know. It's a personal question. It takes a long time to figure out. But since I've sort of staked my life on this, I will conclude with a list of poets that I think have much to do with what's next in poetry. I've cultivated them over the years. They're every single one of them is personally known to me, and is a friend. Academic fairness requires that I disclose this. However, I don't make friends with bad poets, and the greatest poets are my best friends. And the list is this. We've published many of them in Fulcrum, and this is a very short list. I admire lots of poets, and please, nobody should feel offended for not being on this very personal and quiet list. The names are Ben Mazer, who is here, Joseph Green, a poet in Minnesota, where he's one of a million Joe Greens. Jeet Thayil, Thayil. Jeet is J-E-E-T. Indian, lives in Delhi. Katya Kapovich, I'm biased here, she's my wife. But her two English books of verse, The Cossacks in Rome and, Gogol in Rome and Cossacks and Bandits. The Cossacks and the Bandits, something like that. They're still around. John Hennessy, a poet in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I recommend them, and I suggest you watch their work. Thank you very much.
All right.
I'm sorry, this is forever.
I don't know where your children